Hello.
So let me just give a quick intro so everybody knows who these people are. Andrew actually literally wrote the book on resilience. He wrote the book, Resilience, Why Things Bounce Back, and has spent years traveling and researching this topic. And Andy Salkin is the COO of 100 Resilient Cities, which is pioneered by the Rockefeller Foundation, which is an incredible initiative of literally 100 cities all around the world who have created innovation resilience officers and is sharing information back and forth around what works, what's important, what's needed within the resilience space. So they're gonna, kick off and give us a quick overview. One really quick question, resilience, I think everybody understands like the term sort of, but if you could share like what your perspective is, like what that means to you, especially with respect to like urban resilience, and where you see sort of, the biggest, where it's playing out in the most important ways.
Well, maybe I'll start. So, hi, first of all, it's great to see all of you in this amazing space, in a community actually that was very significantly affected by a recent disruption and is still in the process of its own long-term transformation. So, you asked the question about why resilience and sort of why now and what is it. Maybe a short version is, resilience is about the ability of people, communities, and systems to persist, recover, or thrive amid disruption. And given that we live in an age of extraordinary volatility and disruption and continuous perennial shocks to our systems, I think it's arisen now out of kind of a shift to humility about our relationship to these kinds of systems, an understanding that we can't control everything, and that we need to build and boost the ability and capacity of systems to thrive. And if there was a design brief for the 21st century, the ability to build things that can persist, recover, or grow and thrive amid disruption would clearly be it.
Yeah, I think Andrew's definition is a great one, and it's very similar to what we're trying to bring to cities around the world. And what we're trying to do is work with 100 cities to really pilot this concept of urban resilience, and then work with them to help us and them learn what it means to be resilient and how a city can incorporate that resilience lens into how they do their business day in and day out, and really figure out what does it take to reorganize yourself and be able to make these changes that are necessary so that cities can continue to not just survive but adapt and really grow and thrive in the future.
And what are you seeing as like the biggest, how is that playing out? What are the biggest challenges, obstacles, but maybe also opportunities that you're seeing as far as, what's effective, what does resilience actually look like? If you could share a little bit.
It's a great question, Jerry. I think a couple things. First of all, this conversation about how to build and bolster the ability of people and systems to thrive amid disruption is happening among systems people who think about things like economic systems and ecological systems. It's happening among people who think about people, who are social scientists and psychologists and activists and people who are concerned particularly with vulnerable and at-risk communities. It's happening in cities in particular, I think in a very deep way, and it's happening in an organizational context. What are the kinds of organizations of human endeavor, not just companies, but how do we organize people to respond effectively? And if there's a couple of, just odd sort of two thoughts about sort of key thrusts of that work. One of the most important is that it's rooted, especially in communities, in the dynamics of trust and cooperation, empathy, shared identity, and informality. We tend to look a lot traditionally at big formal institutional structures, governments, and the private sector to act. But in fact, when you look at resilient responses, they're almost always ad hocratic, that is to say, not bureaucratic, but improvisational. They come together with bits and pieces of companies and institutions and bits of technology that come together, and when they come together in an environment of trust. So when we think about building resilience at the community level, what we're really doing is talking about encouraging the right kind of precursors. And that means overcoming divisions between us and them, between the communities, certain communities and others, between certain populations and methods and disciplines and others. Right. So I think those are part of it.
So what we're trying to do is go into the cities that have accepted the challenge of trying to become resilient and begin to work with the city, capital C and lowercase c, to help them understand this broad definition of resilience. So for this first year, we've been working specifically with 32 cities. 9 are in the United States, but the rest are sprinkled throughout the rest of the world. And what we're trying to do is help a city, and this is opportunity, right? Cities come to resilience usually with a preconceived idea of what it is. Rarely is it a broad definition. It could be rooted in disaster, risk reduction. A lot of folks it's rooted in sustainability or adaptation to climate change. And what we're trying to do is talk to cities about understanding this broader definition and then asking them, well, what are you going to do about that and how are you going to take action? And so for us, one of the things we're trying to do with cities, and one of our interventions is we're going to give each city that we're working with a grant to hire a chief resilience officer, who in many ways is going to be asked to be empowered by the mayor to work across the government silos, but also work beyond government and work with the different sectors, the communities, the businesses, and help the whole city understand what is it that the city needs to do, what are the priorities for that city, and how can everyone chip in and help build that resilience community. One of the things that we've done in almost every city so far is introduce this broad definition of resilience. You can't just do it with government people. We've sure that the city's bringing in people and maybe they're uncomfortable having at the table, but really having a diverse dialogue. And what we're finding, and a little bit to your opening remarks, is everyone recognizes that there's definitely a threat to their system and infrastructure, whether it's the physical built environment or the physical natural environment, and they understand that. But what people begin to understand when you start to talk about it in this broad way is how important that community is, exactly what Andrew's saying, and how important the individuals are, and how that begins to fit together. And then what the city begins to do is think about how does all of this begin to fit together, and then they go, oosh, this is really hard. Yeah. And that's kind of the first place we start, and that's a big opportunity, is helping people understand that there's more than just disaster, more than just sustainability, more than just development.
Right.
Yeah, in fact, actually, if I could sort of pick up on that theme from Andrew, one mental model that we found really helpful in translating between different disciplines and perspectives on the question of resilience breaks it down into sort of 4 buckets of verbs. So people are always asking, well, this is an interesting concept, but how do I put it into practice? So a resilient community, a resilient system, the cells in your body and in your social network, always doing 4 things. So the first one is about building regenerative capacity. This is typically the kind of slow stuff, the slow building of trust and creative capacity in a community. For instance, it's like in a community, it might be measured by the level of entrepreneurship, the degree of social cohesion. And that's a really slow form of change. Then there's a second bucket, which is about how we instrument systems to listen for change. So how do we actually put systems in place so that we can sense emerging disruptions? Not all disruptions can be sensed in advance, but the very act of listening is itself a form of capacity building. The third one is about responding to disruption, and that's where you see often all that creativity or its absence really show up. When things go badly wrong, when people feel empowered in that context to act creatively in an entrusting way with their neighbors, that's when you see really amazing entrepreneurial things that people couldn't have foretold. They're really specific to the circumstance. And then there's the last bucket, which is about learning and transformation. And learning is what we do to bolster a system when we've seen that it's fragile. Transformation is what we do when we decide that that system is so fragile, that we've learned it's so fragile, that we need to transform its context of use altogether. There are feed-forward and feed-backward loops among all of these things, and the headline is that a truly resilient community person system is doing all 4 of these things at the same time, including you and me and everybody we know. And so the thing to say about it is that resilience is sort of like, it's a frame on change. And you can pick, you want to be involved in the sensing emerging risk part of the framework, or you can be in part of the building, the regenerative capacity form of the framework. There are lots of places to intervene, and data and new technologies in particular are going to play a role in all four.
That's right. And I think the verbs you just used are great, and I think they're the right way to think about it. Where I get really anxious and nervous is, how do you teach people that that's how you live your life, and how do you ingrain this thinking into your being, into your decision making? How do you have the institutions and the organizations that make up a community and the individuals, how do they bring this resilience way of thinking into the practice? And that, in many ways, is what we're going to try to do, working with these 100 cities. We're just getting started with the first 32, and we're in this digestive phase of really embracing this broad definition of resilience. But what's going to happen over the next 6 months with the 32 cities is they're going to start figuring out, how do I take this concept and put it into action in their communities and make it happen. And I think one of the things that you pointed out that exists, and we're taught this over and over and over, is communities and cities in particular are so resilient already, but it's kind of informal. And the question will be, how do we begin to maybe formalize that informalness? How do you begin to take proactive steps to create informal opportunities for things to happen? And I think there's a lot of great ways for us to do that. But how do we find good examples that we can share across networks? And that's one of the things we also hope to do, is facilitate these learnings that can be shared with everybody, because it's easier said than done, but so critical that we almost can't wait around for us to figure it out slowly.
Well, something you said in that, Andrew, I think is so right, that communities and the human species are intrinsically resilient, and there's a lot of lessons to learn that don't have to be discovered, they have to be remembered. And one of the things that, in my work, I have had a chance to go around and live in and work with communities that have experienced disruptions all over the world. We did a big bit of that work for this book. And one of the things that we found is the most consistent is that one of the strongest indicators of a community's resilience in response to, or resilient response to, a significant disruption was predicated on whether they had experienced those disruptions before. So, you see, and often the way that cultural memory is encoded is through the arts. It's through the music. It's through the food traditions of a place. There's a way in which older generations pass on the idea that things can go badly wrong. And they're often not written down in a manual. They're handed on in the way that people normally interact with each other. And so you see that expressed one way in New Orleans, and you see it expressed another way in Japan, and you see it expressed another way in various parts of Africa. And all of those, that sort of relationship between memory and response is a really important one. And that's really one thing I think that's really critical here. Resilience is not about building higher walls. Right after Sandy hit, it was like, oh, we got, let's say, 7-foot, 8-foot waves, let's build a 10-foot wall and go back to life as normal, right? Until we meet an 11-foot wave. Then we'll build a 15-foot wall, right? Pretty soon you're living behind a 100-foot wall, right? And so instead, what you see, if you look at places like, and a great example of this is in the Netherlands, the Dutch have been living with water, screwing things up for them for centuries. They've gotten so good at understanding the kind of ways in which things can go off plan that they're now exporting that knowledge as a growth part of their economy. They're actually teaching other countries, including this one, how to live with the back and forth of water events. And so, it's a kind of a funny thing. It's like it's become a big part of their economy.
But I want to interject. So one of our cities is Rotterdam, who's worked a lot with water, and they said, we've done a lot with water to help protect ourselves from water, but they learned a really important lesson from New York City with Sandy, which is you need to sometimes escape.
Yeah.
And they realized they actually have no route to escape. So in our network, we're sharing these different capacities, and I think it's really interesting. One of the things I think I'd be remiss if we didn't talk about that we both feel strongly about is, it's really easy to think about resilience in shocks and how shocks come and like bang you and you get it. But what's really important to remember is the slow burning stresses that cities and communities really have. And I was reminded of it when in Red Hook, you could build a higher wall that would keep the water out, but the underlying pieces of the community would still be here. You would still have, a neighborhood that's stressed about basic infrastructure, a neighborhood that's cut off from a lot of the city through mass transit, You'd have a neighborhood that has pretty diverse population that maybe has challenges getting hooked up to the economic core. A lot of that isn't going to go away with a higher wall. And the idea of how do you begin to maybe tackle your challenges holistically, so as you're maybe building that infrastructure, how do you actually improve your other stresses and how do they complement each other, is something that we're trying to get cities to think about, because you don't get a lot of money to invest in everything. You only get a little bit of money. How do you make it benefit as much as possible? And we're trying to think about this, and you have a term for it, but we're at the Rockefeller Foundation, they've coined it as the resilience dividend. So how do you get multiple benefits by practicing good resilience?
And I know that time is up, but I just wanted to note to everybody, I really like that how thinking about resilience can be sort of an investment in setting up for how to expect for and anticipate change and how to deal with it before it actually happens, but also that as we think further out into the future, which is somewhat of an exercise that we'll do shortly, what does the future, what does way far into the future look like when sea levels have really risen? Is Red Hook here? Those are sort of really big questions that I invite everyone to not shy away from, and that I know there are some people who are very fascinated in, who will be leading some roundtables after this. So I thank you so much for this conversation. Thank you for the food for thought for after this, and well, just thanks.
Right on. Thanks, guys.
Thanks.